Welcome, everybody, to Musical Theater Talk with Trish Causey. I'm your host, Trish Causey. The response to the show has been so fabulously overwhelming. It's been wonderful. The two guests that I have on today are amazing women, and I'd like to introduce you to them. First guest, her name is Linda Zoghby. Her career spans over 30 years as a leading soloist at the Metropolitan Opera, the White House, the Venetian in Las Vegas. She has sung with Placido Domingo, Jose Carreras, Marilyn Horne, Frederica von Stade, among many, many others. She's appeared countless times at Carnegie Hall, the Kennedy Center, and in opera and symphony halls around the country. Ms. Zoghby studied under the noted mezzo-soprano Elena Nicolaidi at Florida State University. She won prestigious vocal competitions that led to her being chosen to join the Wolf Trap Company and the Juilliard School's American Opera Center. She continued additional long-term study with the Metropolitan Opera staff, conductors, and coaches. Ms. Zoghby has given command performances for Presidents Carter and Reagan, and currently she is a professor of music at the University of South Alabama in Mobile, Alabama, and that's Mobile, not mobile, for those of you who don't live in this area. She has recorded 3 Haydn operas on the London and Decca labels, as well as released a solo CD, Christmas with Linda Zoghby. My other equally fabulous guest is Dr. Wendy LeBorgne, Ph.D. Wendy LeBorgne is a voice pathologist and singing voice specialist and is the director of the Blaine Block Institute for Voice Analysis and Rehabilitation in Dayton, Ohio. Also the Professional Voice Center for Greater Cincinnati, also in Ohio. She holds a BFA in musical theater, woohoo, and both her master's and doctoral degrees in communication sciences and disorders with a specialty in voice disorders. Her research has focused primarily on the professional singing voice, specifically the Broadway belt voice. Her original research has been published in several peer-reviewed journals, and she has authored a training DVD entitled Laryngeal Videostroboscopic, I knew I would screw that up, Images, Normal, and Pathologic Samples. I rehearsed it so well, though. Dr. LeBorgne actively presents nationally and internationally on the professional performing voice. Her clinical work includes providing voice evaluations and therapy for singers and actors in various opera companies, Broadway series, and universities in Cincinnati and Dayton, Ohio, including the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music. In addition to her duties as a voice pathologist, Dr. LeBorgne continues to maintain an active professional performing career. So welcome, Dr. LeBorgne and Ms. Zoghby, and can we go with Linda and Wendy?
Please do.
Thank you. Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay, woo. Okay, we're done with all of that.
I have to go now. No.
Show's over. We used up our time. Well, thanks, everybody.
Right.
I know. Well, this is what happens when I'm able to get really good people for this show. It's because they've done a lot of great things in their life and with their career and have the knowledge to share with those of us who aspire to such greatness as you have already achieved. So with vocal training, let's talk about what the heck vocal training is. When people look into getting voice lessons, let's say, or vocal training, they say, oh, well, I don't want to do that, or I'm afraid of doing that because I don't want to sound like an opera singer, as if becoming an opera singer just happens magically or automatically. So, Linda, would you talk a little bit about vocal training for the stage and why it's important to have?
Anytime you are using the voice singing, whether it's Broadway or opera, it's a means of expressiveness, and you do it with the same instrument. You use it with, your instrument has parts, whether you're going to be singing Broadway or opera, and learning those parts, learning how to use those parts, learning how to coordinate those parts, the respirator, the vibrator, the resonator, the articulator. It's the same instrument. And so really, truly, there's very little change when you look at the whole picture of producing sound that you would need for Broadway. And so I would think that if you want a long-term career and you want to stay healthy and you want to have the most effective sound-making apparatus with the most bang for the buck, so it doesn't really cost you, and you're not singing on capital, and therefore you can sing for years, is to learn your instrument, learn how to coordinate it, learn how to use it.
So when you talk about, go ahead, Wendy.
I was going to say, generally I would say I agree relatively with that. And, I think of I take a little bit more physiologic approach to this. I hate to take the art out of the artist, but from a scientific standpoint, too, I think of these folks as vocal athletes. And I can't think of any Olympic athlete that gets to the Olympics without a coach and a trainer. And you must train the instrument and the muscles that are responsible for voice production, albeit respiration, phonation, and resonance, in an appropriate manner in whatever genre you're singing, whether it's opera, music theater, rock, jazz, it doesn't matter. But I agree that the muscles are the same muscles that are being used, although they may be used slightly differently depending on the genre that you're singing. And to get, again, getting the most bang for your buck is what it's all about, whether it's in opera or music theater, because the reality is we pay for what sounds exciting, and sometimes exciting is not always healthy.
Well, I want to talk about belting, Wendy, because I was talking with Linda earlier, and I was telling her, because I was trained as a coloratura soprano when I was younger, and my first love is musical theater, waka waka all the way. And so in terms of when I would do what my voice teachers have always told me to do for opera or even for singing prettily on the stage in musical theater, it's like that's one thing. And I didn't have a teacher to teach me how to belt. I kind of tried to figure it out on my own. And one of the things that I noticed that was really different in belting was that I would plant my feet and I'd square my shoulders, and in that split second between the big inhalation of the intercostal muscles, opening up the rib cage, and making the sound, that split second in between, I could feel my back muscles engage. But other than that, I really didn't feel a physical difference. Am I weird? What is belting? What are the mechanics of it? And is it safe? So,
those are lots of questions altogether. The what is belting could be a debate in and of itself, all in one show. From the standpoint of do we actually know what belting is, I think perceptually we first have to be able to define it. And as voice teachers, we are still not all defining what belting is as being the same thing. So until we have a perceptual definition of what belting is, it then becomes difficult to objectively tell you exactly what you're doing. My dissertation was on specifically looking at belting perceptually and then objectively. What I can tell you that we know generally about belting, or what's reported, is that it typically is loud. It typically is called what we call heavy phonation, although that's not always true. My personal feeling is that belting is actually based out of the same mechanism we use from a speech perspective. And it's been my feeling, and with singers that I've seen, if they don't speak well, meaning with good resonance, good placement, and good breath support, they are never going to belt well. So, and if they don't know how to shout healthy, they're not going to belt healthy in most cases. Now, you will always have those freak of nature instruments, just like you have those freak of nature athletes. And, I said, who doesn't think that watching Shawn Johnson do, acrobatics on the balance beam is exciting to watch? And I don't care if you're a decently trained gymnast or not, the majority of us may injure ourselves trying to attempt to do what she does. And belting's the same thing. So often we get into patterns where we hear a voice that we want to sound like, or that you're potentially attempting to imitate, and sometimes those are the freak of nature voices because uniqueness gets hired in musical theater, and the imitation is often what injures the person, not necessarily the fact that they can't belt, but they need to learn to belt in their own instrument as opposed to mimicking what they're hearing or seeing. So that's kind of the short answer. If you want a physiologic answer, belting typically has a longer closed phase of vibration than classical singing, just slightly, and most likely there's a little bit more involvement of the thyroarytenoid muscle, which is the bulk of the vocal cord itself, during phonation. But not always. Every instrument is just slightly different. However, your use of breath and your use of resonance is imperative, and there are different schools of thought on how to train belting, and some very strong opinions on that, depending on where you are.
Well, one of the best definitions I ever heard from a non-scientist perspective, but one of the best definitions of belting that I ever heard was a soft yell. And I thought, that's kind of right. And it kind of makes you think, well, I really have to be careful about this. So, Linda, let's talk about breathing and support and the idea of, in vocal training, of being able to have the power to, have the sound go all the way to the back row, as well as the vocal stamina to sing. Several of the questions that I got from people who could not listen live, but they're going to listen later tonight, they wanted to know, what are some exercises, what are some things I can do to build up the stamina to sing a vocally demanding role or to sing lots of performances? So what would you tell somebody in terms of support and stamina and all of that?
Well, I really don't use the words that are overused and don't really conjure up a clear meaning when I teach my students. So I don't use the word support. I use the word lean upon ability and talk about the concept of lean upon ability. If you have that, you're pretty much not going to have strain. You have these intercostal muscles, these muscles in between the ribs, which help to open and close the ribs. And when you try to stay expansive and then you lean against that expansiveness with the muscles that are going to send the air up and out into the vocal folds, the vocal cords, and up into the resonation. If you have a good lean upon ability, then you can have power, because that lean upon ability and that breath pressure will affect either pitch, going higher or lower, and or volume, softer and louder. So that concept of lean upon ability, which people call support, has to do with the staying expansive in the collecting phase after you've collected, but before you've sent the air, to kind of stay lean uponable and therefore be able to have some command over what you want to do. The brain and the vocal cords have their own little party going, so you can stay out of the way there.
Absolutely.
You can stay out of the way there and just think of that as a pass-through. Don't try to be active in the throat, because the brain and the vocal cords upon the command of the brain with whatever the pitch is will lengthen and become tauter or shorter and thicker. And back to what Wendy was saying, of course, I totally agree. And the thyroid arytenoid muscles are mostly responsible for shortening and thickening. But here's why classical training or having a really good teacher can help you, because there's continual changing dynamic of the stretching and thickening, upon which a pitch or loudness might be based or resonance or register. And you're going to use a thyroid arytenoid dominant production, but the cricothyroid muscles, which are usually the head voice, they have to be well coordinated and remain active to keep the cords from over-thickening or producing too heavily weighted a vocal cord. And so really knowing your instrument, sometimes it's guided by ear and then finessing the sound through the registers. Sometimes it's feel, sometimes it's the teacher will be the guide. But I just wanted to add that. And then, let's see, we talked about lean upon ability, and then, training the muscles, training the coordination. Really, the rules of singing are so few, but it takes years to have that sense of coordination and body balance and strengthening of those muscles and use of the instrument in a really seemingly natural way, and it is natural. I like to teach from utterance, natural utterance enhanced, rather than any sort of false way of producing.
So do you find that and this is for either one of you, do you find that in today's instant gratification society and culture that people don't want to go into training because it takes years, or they've heard that so-and-so made it on Broadway or so-and-so made their Met debut saying they've never had a voice lesson? People can download things for free on the internet, like YouTube or wherever, and they can, they want things now. They want it 2 seconds ago, and they're going to get a faster computer so that things happen faster, and that there's a wait. I mean, when there's a waiting time and there's a a horrible thing you have to have called patience. That, you know, when you're training these muscles, like when I teach workshops, especially to teenage kids, I tell them, okay, hey, little girl, and I always pick on the littlest girl who's in the room, but I say, hey, can you go lift that 100-pound box over there? And she looks at me like I'm crazy. And I said, well, no, you can't, but maybe in 8 weeks, if you go to the gym and work with a trainer and you get a specific set of exercises and you do them repetitively and you eat right and drink water and you get your rest in between, in 8 weeks you probably could lift that. And that the voice is the exact same way. You're training so many muscles. Actually, you're training the entire body because your voice is a part of a living, growing, changing organism. And so you're always having to stay on top of the influences that that your body is facing or that your voice is facing. Mm-hmm. So I don't even remember where the question is on that. I just find that the kids today, they don't value training. So it's not even a matter of, I don't want to take voice lessons or it's really not for me, that they don't find a value in it when they hear about singers who've been successful with quote-unquote no training.
Well, and I think that's probably that's more the exception to the rule than probably the rule. And of course, those are the stories that are going to get reported because you know that's what's most exciting. But from a reality standpoint, if we look historically at vocal pedagogy, so many of these singers way back, I mean, they were spending 2 and 3 years on vocalese alone before they were ever allowed to sing a song, let alone, you know, by the end of your first semester in college, you have to have X number of minutes of music that has to be in, you know, such and such a time period. So I can't always blame the student for that because I think some of it is dictated, maybe not even at the collegiate level, but parents expect that if they're paying for lessons for their kids in high school or junior high, that they're going to get something for their money besides scales. Because
parents don't want to hear that. The parents don't want to hear it. I know I've lost 2 voice students in the past because their moms, stage moms, wanted me to teach them songs, and they were nowhere near ready. I mean, they needed to start with lip buzzes and sirens, and they needed to not even go for scales full force, you know. And there's a lot of pressure. It's like to imagine, you know, back in the day when, say, an opera singer would rehearse a role for a year before they put it on stage.
Right.
And so nowadays it's, okay, you've booked this, and this, and you're flying all over the world and doing this role and that role and that role, where you're seeing Broadway performers and even opera performers who have a career of 5, maybe 10 years, and then their voice is shot because they either didn't have the proper training to begin with or, you know, they overused the voice singing too much, you know. But with, go ahead.
I was going to say, if we go back to the analogy of a dancer, if you put a young lady on point too soon, she physiologically may be able to do it for 5 or 10 years, and her injury is not going to show up until later. And it's this early muscle development that we see. So, and at that point, can you undo the damage that's been done? Because after 5 years of doing this on point, then is when you have the injury. So physiologically, could the kid probably belt at 7 or 10? My gosh, we've all seen Annie, right? And yeah, they probably can do it. But where are we, you know, when they're 15 or 20? There are always going to be people who are going to be that exception to the rule. But I can tell you more often than not, these kids potentially set themselves up for injury if they're not well trained to start with, and that the teacher has a good understanding of how young voices develop. And, you know, even in through adolescence, if you look at the average age of the person who is performing on Broadway versus the average age of the performers, even in young artist programs, I think is just slightly older than what we see on the Broadway stage. Mm-hmm. And they have to do with the longevity of the career.
So what do you think the ramifications of doing shows like the Broadway Junior shows that the kid version of Broadway shows? There's the Les Mis, there's Rent, there are all these shows that are meant for, well, not only adult content, but just adult bodies and adult life experience and adult voices. And so you've got these little 9, 10, 12, 13-year-olds trying to belt like Idina Menzel and Patti LuPone, and they're they're trying to go for these full gusto. Linda, do you think that there should be a more natural progression into the performing, the singing on stage, that where you don't get to start out?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the value in any shows that could be put on, if they are well chosen, and if somebody with real desire for a long-term care of the student's voice is in charge, it could serve to excite the students about performing, excite the students about musicals, and get them conversant with them. But they'd have to choose the material very carefully. They could do reviews where they just choose a piece here or a piece there and choose something smart for the child. The child could be in the chorus of community Broadway musicals, community theater, where they're doing the chorus, the children's chorus, or there are ways to get the child excited about the repertory and introduced to the repertory and let them grow their voice in a way that's not harmful without putting on the whole show. So, if one is creative, one can do this without harming the child.
And from a repertoire standpoint, I was going to say to Linda, with Linda, in your training of classical singers, I mean, you typically aren't starting your singers out on arias, I would assume.
Oh, my God.
You might start with, the 24 Italian art songs, right?
No, I have them a year on Vakai. My teacher, Madame Rose Paul, my Tenzer in Mobile, who was trained by Lotte Lehmann, she had me on Vakai in front of a mirror for a year or two, and then she introduced a few songs, and then we did German and French and Italian. And she cared for my long-term voice and then sent me to a wonderful Elena Nicolaidi at Florida State. But the reason I think I'm able to sing for 40-plus years is that she took that care in the early years and didn't use me for her glory,
Right. And the knowledge of the repertoire of what is easy repertoire, what is moderate repertoire, and what is difficult repertoire was appropriate for your age and stage of training. And I think that those songs exist in music theater, but somehow there have been some better books more recently that have sort of categorized some of these songs as far as easy, difficult, or moderate, and then difficult. But people who don't necessarily know the music theater literature may start to run into problems that are picking things that are potentially too difficult for the age and stage of training of a young music theater singer.
It's important to choose your teacher well, someone who has their long-term best interests at heart.
Yeah.
So what are the qualities that you look for if you're going through the phone book and you see teacher, and you call them and you talk to them? What kind of questions would you ask your voice teacher or your potential voice teacher to try and determine who's going to be the best for you?
Well, generally, people would have gotten some references, asked some questions of their friends. With whom are you studying? Do you like it? How does she use the lesson? The parent would talk to other parents. Sometimes you'll call the university and get some recommendations of teachers there. But from the teacher standpoint, if I have someone come and I'm not sure whether I even want to take them, there's a lot of evaluating one can do when you hear them sing a little bit. And true, you have to sort of judge the parent too, because if the parent, if you're going to end up having to produce, a dog and pony show for the parent, then,
right.
I'm not going to be bothered, because that's not necessarily in the best interest of the child.
Right. So now, Wendy, you deal with voice disorders every day. What kind of voice disorders do you see in your practice?
Well, I see everything from pediatrics to adults. So I see kiddos that sing from the time they're very young to folks who are in their 70s and 80s that continue to sing either avocationally or very rarely professionally, but occasionally we see those folks. And I see them everywhere from Broadway to national tours to opera companies here and abroad. Now, my range of scope of practice is probably about 90% professional voice users and probably about 10 to 20% of other voice users, where I may see folks who have pathologies related to vocal abuse, say they're a factory worker, everything. I see everything from cancer to nodules to you name it. I pretty much will see it at some point or have seen it in the last 13 years. If we want to focus specifically on the performing population, The majority of injuries that I see with young singers tend to be overuse or abuse injuries, because if these singers are relatively good at what they do, and we're talking, say, high school and younger, then what tends to happen with these kids is they're overcommitted vocally. They're vocally enthusiastic kids to start with. They're generally not quiet people by nature. And
right.
they tend to overuse. The higher we get in the performance category of professional and pre-professional vocal athletes, these are the injuries that I see in those folks are more acute, like they had to sing through bronchitis or an upper respiratory infection, and it's an acute injury. But by that point, many of them know how to take care of their voices, and it's not a matter of abuse per se. It's more a matter of, I had to do this, the circumstances were not ideal, and now I have an injury. And most of the time, they've tried to fix it themselves before they come to see me.